Chapter 16 of our textbook covers the endocrine system, and we are going to be looking at sections 1 through 4 to answer the following questions. What are the functions of the endocrine system? What is the difference between an endocrine and an exocrine gland? What is a hormone? And can you describe the pathways that peptide hormones and steroids affect cells? What are the functions of the major endocrine glands? So we're going to look at the hypothalamus, the pituitary, the thyroid, the parathyroid, and the adrenal glands. And then we want to know the difference between a positive and negative feedback mechanism when it comes to hormones. So the functions of the endocrine system are largely to produce hormones. And hormones are like chemical messengers that once they're released in the bloodstream affect very specific cells to tell them what to do. And the purpose of these hormones is largely to regulate our other body systems. So when we, for example, talked about the urinary system and the formation of urine, well, the speed and rate at which urine is produced is largely going to be impacted by hormones, by specifically antidiuretic hormone. So, and we'll talk about that here in just a second. But it's the presence or absence of these hormones that's going to affect how the body is functioning at any given time. So first, let's look at the difference between an endocrine and an exocrine gland. So we hopefully recall that when we're talking about glandular tissue, we're largely talking about cuboidal epithelial cells that specialize in secretion. And we've seen examples of glands already when we were looking at the integumentary system. We saw sweat glands, oil glands, and wax glands. And all three of those were examples of exocrine glands, exo like to the outside. And all three of those glands secrete their products to the outside of the body. Sweat goes to the outside of the body. That wax was used to line the cavity on the outside of the body. Oil goes through the skin to the surface. So the purpose of an exocrine gland is to make its product and secrete it to the outside. Opposite of that is an endocrine gland, endo meaning into. And in that case, those glands are going to secrete their products into the bloodstream. And these are largely going to be hormones. And they're going to travel through the bloodstream to wherever their intended target is and then affect those specific cells. And they do that by remaining inside the body, endocrine system. So like we said, hormones are chemical messengers, and because they're floating around in the bloodstream, that means that they are have the power to impact a lot of things. And our body's mechanism for regulating what they are actually able to have an impact on is by designated certain cells as target cells. So only cells that are target cells of a given hormone can be affected by that hormone. And all of the other cells that are not target cells for that hormone will be unaffected and not even know that it's there. And it does that by having a receptor complex, a protein that acts to receive that hormone and tells the cell you are going to now be affected by that hormone. And that happens in a couple of different ways depending on if the hormone is lipid soluble or water soluble, because that's going to affect whether or not it's able to enter the cell, because we know that our cell is surrounded by a phospholipid bilayer plasma membrane. So if the hormone is lipid soluble, like this steroid, then it will be able to travel directly through the phospholipid bilayer of the membrane and end up in the cytoplasm of the cell. And if that's a target cell, then it will have the protein receptor for that hormone, and a protein receptor complex will be formed. If that happens, then that receptor complex will travel into the nucleus through a nuclear pore to affect the DNA on the inside and tell it to activate that specific section of the DNA to perform whatever function that it was sent out to tell the cell to do. We hopefully remember from our discussion of eukaryotic cells that the membrane that's around the nucleus is highly selective about what can go in and out. So this is one example of something that will be allowed into the nucleus of the cell, is a hormone receptor complex. If the hormone in question is not lipid soluble, it's water soluble, that means that that hormone will not be able to travel directly across the plasma membrane. Then the receptor complex is going to be formed at the plasma membrane on the surface of the cell, on the outside. Once that complex is formed, instead of it traveling to the nucleus by itself, a secondary messenger, or relay molecule as it's called here, will be activated in the cytoplasm of the cell, and then that secondary messenger will go into the nucleus to affect the switching on of those certain sections of DNA. So another example of something that could be allowed into past the nuclear envelope. So our next kind of chunk of information here is going to be going through some of the big groups of endocrine glands. And our first set are the hypothalamus and the pituitary. The hypothalamus is the portion of the brain that acts as the link between the nervous system and the endocrine system. It will receive information from the automatic nervous system, and it will then send messages to portions of the endocrine system, which will influence the timed release of specific hormones. So information that it's getting from the nervous system is influencing what it's telling the endocrine system to do. So that's how it performs that function as the link. The hypothalamus is able to do this function through the use of neurosecretory cells. And these are nerve cells that also have the ability to make hormones of their own. So it is a nerve cell. It can receive electrochemical impulses. It can send electrochemical impulses, but it can also secrete hormones. Two of the hormones that are produced by the hypothalamus are oxytocin and antidiuretic hormone. But any hormones produced by the hypothalamus are sent to the posterior pituitary gland, where they're stored until the body receives another signal to tell it to release them. The pituitary gland is attached to the hypothalamus, and it's a stalk-like structure with two separate lobes, and these lobes operate independently from one another. The posterior pituitary, like we said before, won't make any of its hormones on its own. It just receives and stores the hormones made by the hypothalamus. And the example that we're going to look at more closely here in just a second is antidiuretic hormone. The anterior pituitary can make its own hormones, one example being human growth hormone, and then also a lot of the hormones that regulate the reproductive system will come from the anterior pituitary gland. And we will see those in a lot more detail next time when we cover the reproductive system. But even though the anterior pituitary is capable of making its own hormones, when they're produced is still controlled by the hypothalamus. Let's look at a couple of examples. These examples, human growth hormone and antidiuretic hormone. So human growth hormone is produced by the anterior pituitary, and it's produced in relatively high amounts during early childhood and adolescence, and then begins to taper off as we get into adulthood. This makes sense because childhood and adolescence is when we're doing a large amount of our growing, and then as we reach our adult size, that growth slows down. But if a body produces too little human growth hormone, that will lead to a condition called pituitary dwarfism. And then if too much human growth hormone is produced or doesn't stop being produced after adolescence, the condition becomes gigantism, where the person is larger than the average individual. So as kind of a thought experiment for you, if too much human growth hormone causes you to be large, and too little human growth hormone causes you to be smaller than the average human, what do you think the target cells of human growth hormone are? Which cells within our body are stimulated to divide by human growth hormone? Hopefully your initial thoughts are the skeletal system, so bone cells, and perhaps our muscular system, cells of our muscular system, because those are considerably larger in someone like Andre the Giant here than compared to even above average individuals like these people. So mostly the skeletal and muscular system are the target cells of human growth hormone. Our second example here is antidiuretic hormone, which slows down urine production when the body needs to conserve water. So if you're dehydrated and your body says, whoa, we definitely don't want to lose any more water from our bloodstream because the blood's getting too thick or the pH balance is off, we want to stop producing as much urine because we're losing too much water that way. That's the job of antidiuretic hormone, to stop the production. But when we drink alcohol, we disrupt that secretion of ADH. It turns off the ability of our hypothalamus to receive that signal of dehydration from the body, which will prevent ADH from being released and will prevent the slowdown in the production of urine. So because we continue to pee, then we're still going to be losing all of this water. And this is what kind of leads to the effects of the hangover, dehydration, headache, and dry mouth. Those are some of the consequences of drinking alcohol, all because it is influencing our, or preventing our hypothalamus from being able to tell the body how to regulate the water content of our blood. Very cool. I will see you in part 2 to continue our discussion of endocrine tissues.